April 1945. Berlin is shaking under artillery fire, and deep inside the Führer bunker, a quiet man stands just a few steps from the end of the Third Reich. His name is Erich Kempka, a working-class mechanic who only wanted to drive cars, yet somehow ended up behind the wheel for the most dangerous man in Europe. From the front seat, he watched Hitler rise, rule, and the eventual fall. He saw the long campaign trips, the choking paranoia, the bunker arguments, and finally, the moment when loyalty meant helping burn the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun. This documentary will bring back the man history almost forgot, the driver who never sought the spotlight but witnessed the empire's final breath. Born in 1910 in Oberhausen, a city of smokestacks and steel mills in the Ruhr, Erich Kempka grew up in a large, modest family of Polish descent. Motors and machines fascinated him from childhood. By the time he finished his apprenticeship at a DKW dealership in Essen, he had learned not just to fix engines, but to understand their rhythm and precision. Driving for a local newspaper seemed like a respectable path for a young man of skill and discipline. It was steady work, and it kept him close to the machines he loved. Yet he could not have foreseen how those skills would draw him to the center of history. On April 1, 1930, Kempka joined the National Socialist Party, getting number 225,639, a decision that seemed small at the time. He soon became a driver for Joseph Terboven, the regional party leader in Essen. It was ordinary advancement in the party's hierarchy until February 1932, when a short, urgent telegram arrived. It commanded him to present himself at Hitler's private chancellery at the Kaiserhof Hotel in Berlin. The words were brief, but the implications enormous. The train ride north was long and suffused with anxiety. Kempka sat among strangers in a third-class carriage, clinging to his small bundle of belongings, replaying every moment that might have led to this summons. He pictured the imposing streets of Berlin, imagining the grand buildings and political gatherings that his telegram hinted at. By the time the train crossed the city limits, his nerves were taut with anticipation. At the Kaiserhof, around 30 other men waited. They were drivers like him, summoned from across Germany. The room buzzed with quiet tension, each man aware that only one would leave with a life changed forever. When Wilhelm Bruckner, Hitler's aide, called them forward, Kempka noticed the precise manner in which each man was positioned. He was the shortest, standing at the far left, feeling both insignificant and keenly observed. Hitler entered with a presence that made the room shrink. His questions cut sharply into Kempka's mind, technical and personal at once. "How would you handle a Mercedes under sudden ice?" one inquiry demanded. Another asked about habits, travel routes, and the maintenance of engines under pressure. Hitler's knowledge of mechanics was thorough, and his gaze unrelenting. Kempka answered as best he could, speaking of gear ratios, fuel mixtures, and long nights repairing engines. When it was over, Hitler extended his hand. That gesture, firm and deliberate, confirmed what Kempka dared to hope. He had impressed the man who might shape the nation. No announcement followed that day. The candidates were dismissed, sent back to their cities with a mixture of relief and unresolved tension. But the encounter had already left a deep impression. In Berlin, the scale of the city, the imposing Kaiserhof, and the intensity of Hitler's interrogation remained vivid in his memory. The notion that he could play a role in history's unfolding drama lingered as both an opportunity and a burden. Back in Essen, Kempka tried to return to ordinary life. The newspaper deliveries and errands felt smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what might come next. A few days later, the uncertainty was lifted by another telegram, this one even shorter. "Report to Munich and meet Rudolf Hess." The message left no room for doubt. He had been chosen as Hitler's driver. In that moment, Kempka crossed the threshold from ordinary mechanic to participant in the most extraordinary and terrifying theater of power Germany had ever known. Kempka arrived at the Daimler-Benz headquarters in Munich with nerves and excitement running side by side. The building smelled of oil and rubber, and the mechanics worked with sharp precision. Waiting for him was Julius Schreck, Hitler's longtime driver. Schreck didn't bother with pleasantries. He wanted to know if Kempka had ever handled a 6-liter Mercedes with a supercharged engine. Kempka admitted he hadn't, and Schreck immediately put him behind the wheel of one. The car was an open-body machine with a massive engine, and as Kempka drove through Munich with Schreck watching every move, he felt the pressure of being tested. When they reached Berlin, Kempka met Hitler again. This time, Hitler didn't ask about engines, but about Kempka's family and upbringing. Kempka realized the questions were not random. Hitler wanted to measure loyalty as much as skill. Soon after, Kempka was assigned to the guest car during the presidential election campaign. The days blurred into speeches, rallies, and long drives. Hitler charted the routes himself and even made small snacks for the drivers on tight schedules. Kempka learned that driving for Hitler meant managing timing, reading the mood, and staying invisible while seeing everything. Over the course of the campaign, Kempka logged over 12,000 kilometers across Germany, learning not only the roads, but the rhythms of political life at its highest levels. He rarely discussed politics with Hitler, yet the personal bond grew. The leader's treatment of drivers and pilots reflected a strange blend of paternal concern and calculated trust. Each day behind the wheel offered insight into Hitler's meticulous planning and obsessive control over even small details, like meal breaks or the timing of arrivals. Then came May 16, 1936. Kempka arrived at Hitler's apartment in Munich to find the Führer shaken. Julius Schreck had died suddenly from fulminant meningitis. Kempka, at just 26, was promoted immediately to head the Führer's automobile unit with the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS. The responsibilities were immense. He now oversaw workshops, expanded garages, supervised mechanics, and maintained vehicle communications across Germany. Every car, every engine, every route became his responsibility. Kempka also played a pivotal role in advancing the safety of Hitler's travel. After the 1939 assassination attempt at the Munich beer hall, Kempka pushed Hitler to use armored cars. Hitler resisted at first, but finally agreed. The reinforced Mercedes became part of the regular motorcade. Kempka also delivered vehicles as diplomatic gifts to foreign leaders, including Marshal Mannerheim of Finland, Ion Antonescu of Romania, and Boris III of Bulgaria. These trips gave him rare access to political conversations and ceremonies far beyond anything he imagined when he first climbed into a car as an apprentice. By the late 1930s, Kempka was no longer simply a driver. He had become a trusted figure within Hitler's inner circle, traveling through Europe and witnessing how decisions were made behind closed doors. He learned how schedules were manipulated to shape appearances and how loyalty was tested through constant vigilance. The roads he traveled showed him both the reach of the regime and the fear that held it together. At the same time, he knew that being so close to Hitler carried real danger. One mistake could end his career or his life. The lessons he learned on the road blended technical skill with instinct, caution, and the ability to read the shifting moods of those in power. As the war approached, the pressure only grew. The same roads that once carried campaign motorcades would soon carry him deeper into a system racing toward destruction, and the secrets he witnessed there would follow him long after the engines went silent. Kempka's work eventually carried him south toward the Alps, where the roads thinned and the pace slowed. But the politics behind closed doors only grew sharper. His first trip to the Obersalzberg came in the spring of 1932. Snow still covered the paths, and the climb to the house called Haus Wachenfeld was so steep they had to haul luggage up on sleds. Nothing about it suggested a future command center. It felt like a modest retreat with creaking wooden beams, narrow rooms, and the smell of wet pine drifting inside whenever the door opened. After months of rallies and roaring engines, the quiet surprised him. Angela Raubal, Hitler's half-sister, welcomed visitors with warmth that Berlin never offered. Hitler treated the mountain as a refuge. Kempka often saw him walking the paths as if the forests steadied him. As royalties from Mein Kampf grew, the house expanded. Walls moved outward, wide terraces were added, and Haus Wachenfeld became the Berghof. Soon diplomats, ministers, and visiting leaders lined up on the terrace, where days earlier only sunlight and mountain fog had settled. Relaxation and politics merged so tightly that Kempka sometimes couldn't tell which mood ruled the day. By the mid-1930s, a new figure arrived who would change everything. Martin Bormann came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, but Kempka sensed his ambition early. Bormann had been working under Rudolf Hess, but here on the mountain he found room to build something of his own. He began buying land from local families, sometimes at high prices, sometimes with pressure they could not resist. Little by little, he surrounded the Berghof with parcels that fell under his control. Farmers who had lived there for generations were pushed out. Buildings vanished. Forest edges shifted. Kempka realized Bormann wasn't just expanding property. He was laying down a kind of invisible fence, one that made Hitler's home a place only he fully managed. Bormann crafted an image of constant work. He rushed through hallways, filled his desk with papers, and slipped from meals after only a few bites. Hitler mistook it for loyalty. Bormann soon controlled the Berghof's administration, and staff who once moved freely now watched every step. Even simple messages to Hitler passed through him. One day Hitler remarked that a nearby farm spoiled the view. By the next morning, it was gone. Another time he complained about the afternoon heat, and Bormann had a tree planted overnight. The message was clear. He could alter the mountain itself if it helped him rise. The situation shifted again in May 1941, after Rudolf Hess flew alone to Scotland in an attempt to negotiate peace. The news hit the Berghof like a shockwave. Hitler raged, calling it betrayal and madness. Hess's name was removed from offices and documents. Photographs disappeared. It became dangerous even to mention him. In the sudden vacuum, Bormann stepped forward and took over party chancellery duties, widening his authority even further. Generals now waited for his approval before entering a room. Life at the Berghof carried a strange double tone. Eva Braun, visiting since 1936, added warmth with parties, film nights, and quiet touches of comfort. Yet the estate was heavily guarded by Himmler's Reich Protection Service, with SS patrols on the roads and every movement logged. Dr. Theodor Morell, awkward but indispensable, tended to Hitler daily with injections and tonics that many in the household distrusted. Despite the layers of security, Hitler seemed calmer in the mountains, walking slowly after breakfast, watching shadows drift across the valley, or speaking with an ease Kempka rarely saw elsewhere. But the atmosphere shifted over time. The openness Angela Raubal once brought faded. Doors closed more often. Conversations dropped to whispers. Staff stopped joking. The mountain retreat that once felt peaceful tightened around them, and the silence no longer felt gentle. It felt like something closing in. Kempka felt the shift from mountain calm to rising tension long before the situation escalated out of proportion. By the end of the 1930s, Hitler carried himself with a kind of certainty that came from the diplomatic victories he liked to list. The Saar Basin had returned to German control in 1935. Austria followed in March 1938. Then came the Sudetenland that autumn after the Munich Agreement. All of it happened without war, and Hitler spoke about these gains as proof that the world would always yield if pushed hard enough. Kempka, sitting behind the wheel on long drives, listened to these monologues and sensed how each success hardened the next step. One day, in the early hours of March 15, 1939, he was told to prepare a convoy heading toward the Czech border. The plan shifted several times, but Kempka ended up driving Emil Hácha, the elderly president of Czechoslovakia, from the Berlin station to the Reich Chancellery. Hácha had been up all night, and his hands shook as he stepped into the car. Inside the building, under intense pressure, he collapsed and had to be treated by Dr. Theodor Morell, who pushed his way in with his medical bag. Kempka wasn't in the room when Hitler spoke to Hácha, but he heard the rushed footsteps in the hallway and saw Morell's anxious face afterward. That afternoon, Hitler boarded his special train and headed south. Kempka followed by road. Snow hammered the border region as Kempka switched to an off-road vehicle. He drove with Hitler in the front seat and a thin escort trailing behind. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the wind blew so hard that the headlights caught only bursts of swirling white. The customs gate lifted without a challenge. The convoy rolled into the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in near silence. Kempka later remembered how unreal it felt. No gunfire, no barricades, just a few surprised guards watching them pass. The group was so lightly armed that members of Hitler's guard had to share pistols with the men assigned to secure the route. Looking back years later, Kempka admitted he didn't understand why no one stopped them. A handful of determined soldiers could have changed the entire course of events that day. With the war underway, the trips multiplied. Every movement, Vienna, Munich, Warsaw, Paris, followed tight schedules with long nights and constant tension. Kempka slept in cars, depots, and small barracks rooms when he could. He followed Hitler by train, plane, or motorcade, sometimes switching between all three modes in a single week. One trip stayed fixed in his memory, a visit to Zaporizhzhia in 1942. The Eastern Front was shifting dangerously, and German units near the Dnieper were under heavy pressure. Despite warnings from his generals, Hitler insisted on staying near an airfield close to the fighting. Kempka saw the thin defensive line, heard distant artillery, and watched officers argue in low, urgent voices. Only after Soviet aircraft struck a nearby position did Hitler agree to leave. For Kempka, that experience marked the moment he realized that the later claims about Hitler's supposed fear of the front ignored days like this when he placed himself far closer to danger than many expected. The monotony of headquarters contrasted sharply with the tension of those long wartime journeys. Days blended into briefings, late-night reports, and cold early departures. Hitler often spoke about sending his staff to frontline units for short stretches, saying it would give them real experience. But whenever Kempka asked to go, Hitler refused. He said there was no one else who understood the routines, the timing, and the risks of the road the way Kempka did. So Kempka stayed behind the wheel, waiting for whatever came next, never sure where the next order would lead him. When Kempka returned from his father's funeral in early January 1945, he stepped into a headquarters that felt hollowed out. Ziegenberg, once busy with officers and constant planning, had turned strangely quiet. Reports piled on desks showed the same picture everywhere: bombed cities, broken rail lines, factories without fuel, and armies pushed back on every front. No one pretended things would turn around. For the first time, Kempka saw a staff that moved without speeches, without hope, just a silent understanding that the end was coming. What stunned him most was Hitler's decision to return to Berlin. Everyone had assumed the last stand would be made in the south. Instead, orders came to move immediately. Convoys rolled out, communications gear was packed, and entire offices were emptied overnight. Hitler boarded his special train for the final time. Kempka drove ahead to Grunewald station, still numb from his own loss. When Hitler stepped down, Kempka barely recognized him. His posture sagged, his face looked drawn, and his movements had lost their sharpness. Kempka never forgot that moment. It was the first time he saw Hitler look beaten. The Chancellery, unprepared to serve as headquarters again, felt thrown together. Technicians scrambled to install radios and teletypes. Maps were taped to walls that once held ceremonial displays. The expanded bunker below still looked makeshift, its wiring and ventilation rough from rushed construction. Kempka's drives grew more dangerous as he shuttled between Berlin and outlying posts like Zossen. Roads were fractured, bridges unstable, and rubble blocked whole streets. Fire crews sometimes had to clear a path before he could pass. His drivers lived on no schedule at all. They slept in their cars, hauling officers, rescuing wounded staff, or helping civilians after raids. Kempka later said no one complained. The closeness of the front gave every task a kind of urgency that didn't need explaining. One of his hardest duties came when Field Marshal Albert Kesselring needed to move between Berlin and Bad Nauheim. Kempka took the wheel himself. The roads were lined with wrecked armor and burned trucks. Low-flying fighters swept over the highways. Every trip became a gamble, guided by instinct and luck. In early March, Hitler took his last car trip, wanting to inspect positions near Frankfurt an der Oder. Crowds gathered along the streets, hoping for reassurance. Soldiers saluted. Women waved. Children stared. That short drive became his final appearance above ground. Afterward, he retreated into the bunker for good. Kempka soon left Berlin with Albert Speer for a 5-day tour of the Western defenses. They traveled mostly at night with dimmed headlamps, dodging aircraft and artillery flashes. More than once, bullets hit the roadside, forcing Kempka into ditches until the danger passed. When they returned, he felt the exhaustion settle in all at once. Inside the chancellery, everything had gone muted. Teletypes still clicked, but the old energy was gone. Hitler emerged from a meeting, walked straight to Kempka, and embraced him, thanking him for protecting Speer. The gesture stunned everyone, especially Bormann, who had spent years pushing Kempka aside. By April 20th, Hitler's birthday, Berlin was surrounded. Visitors filed silently through dim hallways. At midnight, Soviet guns opened fire on the city center. Dust shook loose from the bunker ceiling. Dr. Morell left soon after, replaced on paper by Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, though Hitler barely saw either of them. The mood sank even lower when Walter Huell showed staff a Soviet propaganda pamphlet by Ilya Ehrenburg, urging ruthless treatment of Germans. Kempka remembered the way the room fell quiet. It confirmed what many already feared. There would be no rescue, no negotiations. Above them, the city struggled on. Trams still ran in some districts, and a few factories kept working when electricity reached them. Kempka admired the stubbornness of these workers, calling it its own kind of bravery. Goebbels moved his family into the bunker as the chancellery took heavier damage. On April 24th, a bombardment buried more than 60 of Kempka's cars. Years of work disappeared in one night. The next day, Speer returned unexpectedly, landing his plane on a Berlin street. After meeting Hitler, he quietly urged Joachim von Ribbentrop to flee. Ribbentrop left before nightfall. Then a telegram arrived from Göring, invoking a decree naming him Hitler's successor if Hitler became incapacitated. To those in the bunker, it felt like the first open sign that even the highest ranks were breaking apart, and no one knew what would follow. Eva Braun's calm presence in the bunker felt strangely out of place in those collapsing days. The city above was shaking apart, yet she moved through the underground rooms with the same steady look she had shown for years. She told Kempka she had come to Berlin on her own choice, and nothing, not even Hitler's earlier attempts to keep her away, would make her leave now. She said it quietly, almost like she was explaining a simple fact. She also shared something that surprised him. Hitler, she said, had long understood what Martin Bormann truly was. But the war had locked every man in his position, even the ones he no longer trusted. It was one of the few times Kempka heard her speak so directly about the power struggles inside the circle. Life in the bunker grew rougher by the day. The concrete shook as artillery shells landed closer each hour. The air in the corridors carried a mix of dust, exhaustion, and fear. Above ground, the Soviet push crushed every line still standing. Kempka sometimes accompanied Dr. Ernst Hasse to underground rooms converted into hospitals, where the wounded lay on stretchers crowded wall to wall. Men from the Volkssturm, teenage soldiers, and officers from broken units all blended into the same quiet line of suffering. Those scenes followed him back through the tunnels, hanging over the rest of his duties, like a shadow he couldn't shake. The tension was broken for a moment, if it could be called that, on April 26th. Late in the day, word spread that a small aircraft had landed in Berlin in the middle of the fighting. Minutes later, General Robert Ritter von Greim arrived, badly wounded in the foot. He had been flown in by Hanna Reich, one of Germany's most skilled pilots, who had guided their aircraft through Soviet fire to reach the city. Kempka watched her move through the bunker with a strange mix of sharp discipline and almost gentle energy. Hours after risking her life in that flight, she was seen comforting Goebbels' children, speaking to them with the warmth of a favorite aunt. It was a moment that stayed with Kempka because it showed how strange the bunker had become. Hard steel and soft humanity pressed together in a place with no future. But the sense of a brief lift did not last. That same night, Kempka met Hermann Fegelein, Eva Braun's brother-in-law, who slipped him a briefcase and asked him to keep it safe until morning. His request was vague, and Kempka did not ask questions. Within an hour, Fegelein had vanished. When his escort returned without him, the bunker shifted into a different kind of alarm. A message had broken through confirming that Heinrich Himmler was secretly negotiating with Count Folke Bernadotte of Sweden to surrender to the Western Allies. In the bunker, this news hit even harder than Göring's attempt to claim succession. If Göring had shaken loyalty, Himmler's move shattered it completely. Bormann reacted the fastest. He stormed through the corridors demanding one answer. "Where is Fegelein?" Some in the bunker froze at the name, knowing Fegelein was Himmler's representative, and the missing briefcase suddenly carried a new meaning. The worry tightened the air. Secretaries whispered about poison capsules. Hanna Reich, even with her calm, seemed shaken. A few people asked Hitler directly for poison, terrified of being captured by the Soviets if the city fell that night. The circle narrowed when Fegelein's aide was arrested. His story confirmed what many feared. Fegelein had left his apartment in civilian clothes and planned to disappear into the crowds fleeing the center of Berlin. He hoped to wait out the battle and later join Himmler. When Fegelein himself was caught shortly after, Kempka saw him brought back to the compound, disheveled and frightened. Documents tied to Himmler's negotiations were found with him, along with money and gold meant for escape. To Kempka, it felt unreal. Only days earlier, he had spoken with Fegelein as if they still had a future beyond the bunker. Hitler ordered a trial immediately. The hearing was short. Even with Eva Braun in the next room, Hitler signed the execution order. Fegelein barely reacted when told. In the courtyard near the Foreign Ministry, a handful of guards carried out the sentence. Kempka stood close enough to hear the shots disappear under the deeper rumble of artillery. Not long after, Hitler gave another order. He demanded the poison capsule provided by Himmler be tested. He chose Blondie, his own dog. Kempka watched from the edge of the room as the animal collapsed almost at once. It confirmed what everyone already sensed. Hitler no longer trusted anyone, and the decisions ahead would only grow darker. It was the early hours of April 29, 1945, and Berlin was shaking under artillery that never stopped. But somewhere deep beneath the ruined Reich Chancellery, in a small room with bare walls and a table pulled in at the last minute, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun signed their names into a marriage book. Kempka later noted how strange the moment felt. Shells thudded overhead, dust drifted down from concrete seams, yet the people inside spoke in low voices, almost as if trying not to disturb a fragile pocket of calm. Hitler stood stiffly. Eva looked pale but steady. The witnesses, Goebbels, Bormann, and a few aides, kept their expressions tight. unable to ignore the sense that the end pressed against the door. To Kempka, the reason behind the ceremony was clear. Hitler didn't want her remembered only as his mistress. Eva had spent more than a decade in his shadow. She stayed with him in Munich, at the Berghof, and all the way down into the bunker, while the city around them burned. This last-minute marriage was meant to give her a title, even if it came at a moment when titles meant nothing. For a brief time afterward, they shared a small after-dinner gathering. Someone opened a bottle of wine. Someone else tried to make a joke. The room filled with the clatter of dishes and forced laughter, the kind people make when they know the world outside has already collapsed. Word spread unevenly. Some bunker staff heard it hours later. Others didn't believe it until a secretary confirmed it. For most people in Germany, Eva Braun barely existed. She had never appeared in public roles or official announcements. But below ground, the marriage felt like a signal. The last chapter was being written, and everyone present sensed that the end would come within days, maybe hours. Before dawn, Hitler called Goebbels and Bormann back into the conference room. Soviet forces were already closing in around the Tiergarten, and reports came in that the Reichstag was nearly encircled. Hitler read from notes he had written overnight. He declared that Karl Dönitz, the admiral stationed in northern Germany, would become president. He named Goebbels as the new chancellor. Kempka would later describe this meeting as colder and more clinical than expected. There was no pretense now. Hitler was arranging the Reich's future for a time he knew he wouldn't see. Convincing Goebbels to leave Berlin proved impossible. Hitler pressed him to go north to rejoin Dönitz and continue the government. But Goebbels refused in a burst of emotion. He said he could not desert his post as defense commissioner of Berlin. He said he would not abandon his wife and children. He said his place was with the Führer. The argument escalated sharply. Voices rose. Chairs scraped. Hitler shouted back, insisting on the practicality of escape. Goebbels fired back with something closer to devotion than reason. The confrontation ended only when Goebbels broke into tears, insisting that he would remain in the capital, whether Hitler agreed or not. Hitler finally let the matter drop. Soon after, Goebbels dictated his political testament to Traudl Junge. He paced while speaking, listing explanations, justifications, and final declarations. The room was silent except for his voice and the sound of the typewriter. It was another sign that time was running out, and every minute was being filled with last words. Later that day, Kempka received word that Hitler wanted to see him. This meeting, Kempka realized, would almost surely be their final one. He walked past guards who looked exhausted and past secretaries who were sorting papers they might never send. When he entered the room, Hitler was standing by a table with a map spread open. His uniform was neat, but he looked smaller, and there was a noticeable tremor in his left hand. Still, his voice was steady. He asked about the drivers, whether they were holding up, whether they still believed that General Wenck's 12th Army might break through to relieve Berlin. Kempka said what he knew Hitler expected to hear. The men were waiting for Wenck. Hitler nodded and answered quietly, "We're all waiting for Wenck," though both of them understood that Wenck was still miles away and fighting his own battles just to stay intact. Hitler then extended his hand. Kempka shook it. He felt how cold the Führer's skin had become. Hitler dismissed him with a short nod and turned back to the map. As evening fell, the bunker prepared the final documents. Hitler signed both his political and his personal testament. Goebbels did the same. Messengers were chosen and briefed, then sent out through the smoke-filled streets in desperate attempts to break through Soviet lines. The bunker lights flickered with each artillery hit. The walls shook. No one knew if the messengers would make it more than a block. And somewhere beyond the ruined chancellery, the Red Army's guns crept closer. their blasts rolling through the corridors like the slow closing of a final door. By the morning of April 30th, 1945, the Reich Chancellery was barely holding together. Artillery from the Soviet 79th Rifle Corps shook the building non-stop, turning the walls into trembling plates of dust and plaster. Doors rattled, lights flickered. Every few minutes, another explosion sent a jolt through the bunker beneath Wilhelmstrasse. Kempka had been through air raids before, but nothing matched this. This was the final squeeze, and everyone sensed it. Around midday, Hitler ate his last meal. It was plain, quiet, almost formal. Secretaries later said the table felt stiff, as if no one dared break the moment's wait. When it ended, Hitler shook hands with his staff, thanked them, and withdrew with Eva Braun to their rooms. No one saw them again. Kempka was in the wrecked garage when the phone rang. Otto Günsche first asked for liquor, then called back with urgency. He needed 200 liters of fuel at once. Kempka tried to explain the vehicles were smashed or burning, but Günsche wouldn't listen. Kempka gathered whatever fuel he could salvage from the ruined motor pool and hurried to the bunker. At the entrance, Günsche met him, gray-faced, and made a small gesture mimicking a gun to the head. Then he said the words that froze Kempka in place. "The boss is dead." Hitler had shot himself around 3:30 p.m. Eva Braun had taken poison beside him. Linge, Bormann, Günsche, and Dr. Stumpfeger had entered the room and confirmed it. Following Hitler's last orders, the bodies were to be burned. Linge and Stumpfeger brought Hitler's body wrapped in a blanket, his arm hanging stiffly. Bormann followed with Eva Braun. Kempka stepped forward, unable to watch Bormann handle her, and carried Eva himself. Under constant shelling, they climbed to the Chancellery garden and laid the bodies in a shallow crater. Kempka ran back and forth through the courtyard, hauling fuel canisters while shells burst nearby. When enough fuel had been gathered, the bodies were soaked. A torch made from an oil-soaked rag was lit with matches handed over by Goebbels. The flames rose fast, joining the smoke of the burning city. Shell bursts kept knocking debris onto the pyre, but the small group continued adding fuel until the cremation was complete. Below ground, routine resumed in grim fragments. That night, General Hans Krebs walked out under a white flag to meet the Soviets. At the ruined Bendler block. He returned before dawn. Unconditional surrender was the only offer. On May 1st, Goebbels asked for more fuel. He and Magda had decided to die. Their 6 children, still in the bunker, were poisoned that afternoon. Soon after, Goebbels and his wife went above ground and killed themselves. A heavy silence spread through the corridors. Even in those hours, life pushed through in strange ways. A wounded young woman begged to see her fiancé, one of Kempka's drivers. They asked to marry before the end. With no chaplain available, Kempka stood beside her bed, spoke the vows, and watched them hold each other as the bunker shook around them. By nightfall, breakout groups formed. Documents were burned. Weapons checked. Kempka gathered women, wounded men, and his drivers. When the shelling eased, they climbed the steps into the shattered garden. Berlin above was almost unrecognizable. Streets blocked by craters, buildings leaning like broken teeth, fires burning without control. Soviet searchlights swept the ruins. The city felt hollow, stripped of sound and time. And still, Kempka and his group pushed forward into the wreckage, each step carrying them deeper into the collapse of a world already gone. In the last hours before dawn on May 2nd, Berlin no longer felt like a city at all. Fires had eaten through whole districts, and the smoke hung low and thick, glowing red from the ruins beneath it. Near the Admiralspalast, Erich Kempka gathered the last men still willing to stay with him. He told anyone who wanted to run that this was the moment. There was no plan left, only noise. Artillery thudding from the north, the grind of Soviet armor, the crack of collapsing stone. Then Martin Bormann appeared with Ludwig Stumpfeger and a few others. They looked drained, as if they had walked through the fire itself. They carried only grim news. The Goebbels family was dead, the Soviets were closing in, and they needed an armored vehicle if they hoped to break out. Before Kempka could answer, the clank of tank tracks rolled toward them. A few battered Panzer IVs, scorched along their flanks, emerged from behind a ruined building. The group pressed close to the hulls as they pushed up the street. Kempka followed a short distance behind Bormann and Stumpfeger, stepping over rubble and torn-up tram rails. A white flash cut across the lead tank. The blast slammed Stumpfeger into Kempka and hurled them both to the ground. When Kempka came to, everything was dust and smoke. His vision narrowed to a blur until he spotted Georg Betz, one of Hitler's pilots, slumped among broken bricks. Betz was alive but fading. Kempka helped him back toward the Admiral's Palast, though every few steps Betz faltered. A dentist attached to Bormann's staff tried to treat him, but the injuries were too severe. Betz died soon after. Staring at his friend's body, Kempka finally accepted that a large group would never make it out. They were too visible, too desperate, too slow. He told his men to split up, find civilian clothing, and try on their own. A few stayed at his side as they moved toward Friedrichstrasse. Fires, wreckage, and gunfire blocked nearly every street. They ducked into a tram workshop where foreign laborers were hiding. The workers handed them old clothes and offered a corner to rest. Sleep barely began when a Soviet patrol burst in. Kempka froze, but a young Yugoslav woman stepped forward and told the commissar that Kempka was her husband, a worker trapped in the bombing. The commissar accepted it, or simply didn't care. He opened a bottle, shouted for more men, and dragged everyone into a rough celebration. Kempka played along because there was no choice. When the patrol left, Kempka woke with one clear task: erase anything that tied them to their past. Papers, badges, insignia, all of it went into a small fire in the corner. They dressed fully as laborers now, anonymous inside a broken city. He told the men the unit was finished, and each should go his own way. But the commissar reappeared, laughing and drunk, and forced them into yet another round of celebration. Only when the Yugoslav woman returned did they slip away. She guided Kempka and a Hungarian aristocrat through back streets and past checkpoints toward Tegel, then vanished. The weeks that followed pushed Kempka across central Germany. He swam the Elbe to avoid Soviet patrols. He passed through towns flattened by the fighting. At Wittenberg, he found a German interpreter working for the Allies who secured papers in Kempka's real name. With those, he reached Burgkunstadt and saw his wife again. Briefly. Someone recognized him and reported it. Soon after, the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps arrived and arrested him, ending the escape as suddenly as it had begun. Kempka's arrest in Burgkunstadt dropped him into a long stretch of uncertainty that felt less like justice and more like drifting from one holding pen to another. The first American team that took him in treated him with that mix of caution and impatience common in the early months after the war. He was one more man from the last circle around Hitler, and that alone made him valuable. From the start, the questions circled the same point. Where was Hitler? And how could Kempka be sure the man was dead? It didn't matter how many times he repeated the details: the gunshot inside the bunker, the smell of gasoline in the Chancellery Garden, the flames rising under shellfire on April 30th, 1945. Each officer who questioned him wanted the scene again, step by step, as if repeating it enough times might unlock some detail he had forgotten to mention. Every transfer to a new camp began the same way. A list of men were loaded onto a truck, driven to another facility, and set in front of interrogators who read from the same script. They pressed him on rumors they had picked up: submarines supposedly waiting in Bremen, secret aircraft hidden near the Alps, flights to Spain or Japan. Kempka answered the same way each time. Hitler had not fled the city. The war was already lost, and the leader he had driven since 1932 had chosen to die where the regime began. Still, the officers pushed, partly because the disappearance of the body made the truth feel less solid, partly because conspiracy theories filled the vacuum that defeat had created. The strain built slowly. Some interrogators moved from serious questions to strange ones. They asked what Hitler ate for breakfast, which hand he used when cutting food, whether he favored a certain leg when he stood. Kempka realized this wasn't meant to poke fun at him. The Allies were trying to build a picture of the man who had dragged Europe into catastrophe. They wanted every behavior, every quirk, every detail that explained how a nation had followed him. But answering these questions forced Kempka back into memories he had tried to set aside: days of long motorcades, crowded rallies, and the quiet moments in the car when Hitler sat lost in thought. In June 1946, soldiers took him without warning to Nuremberg. The war crimes trials were underway, and he was needed as a witness. He wasn't on trial, but he felt the eyes on him from the moment he entered the courthouse. Guards treated him politely, even formally, as though stepping into the courtroom placed him in a different category. When he stood before the American prosecutor and swore to tell the truth, he felt the weight of the past 13 years settle onto his shoulders. The prosecutor pressed hard, surprised that a driver had stood so close to so many events. Kempka tried to explain that his job had always put him near the center. Others who might have supported his story were either dead or held by the Soviets. He was left carrying the pieces of the last week in Berlin, almost alone. During the weeks he stayed in the witness wing, he saw faces he had known in peacetime and during the war. Some men showed a kind of stubborn pride, refusing to bend or beg. Others shifted their tone completely, eager to please the guards or distance themselves from old loyalties. Seeing this change, Kempka thought about how quickly people broke when the world that protected them vanished. He remembered something Hitler had once said to him back in 1933. He would never leave the Chancellery alive. At the time, it had sounded dramatic, even theatrical. Now it felt like the only accurate prophecy Hitler ever made. After his testimony, Kempka returned to the same pattern: transfers, camps, and waiting. He passed through Langwasser, then Regensburg, then Ludwigsburg. Each camp blurred into the next: barbed wire, roll calls, and days marked by uncertainty. A severe injury in a transport accident finally ended his captivity. In 1947, the Americans released him, bringing his long path from fugitive to prisoner to an abrupt halt. Kempka later said he never tried to defend himself or condemn anyone. He only wanted to tell what he had seen, even if the story placed him uncomfortably close to the center of events. He described himself as an ordinary man who happened to work for a leader whose decisions shaped the century. To him, history would decide what those years meant, not the men who lived through them. Yet his own path shows the contradictions of those who worked beside absolute power. He stood close enough to witness Hitler's private world and the final moments in April 1945. But he avoided taking responsibility for the crimes carried out by the regime he served. His memoirs, published after the war, turned into a key source for anyone trying to piece together those final, suffocating days in the bunker. They pulled back the curtain just enough to show what he saw, yet never far enough to confront what it all meant. He faced no war crimes charges, and slipped into a quiet life once he was released. And on January 24, 1975, in Freiburg im Breisgau, his story ended at 64. What remained was the testimony of a man who stood inches from history's fire, felt the heat on his face, and somehow walked out of the smoke, still insisting he was only a witness.